Hello, good morning to everybody. Welcome to the Edgerton Series of the Pacific Council. Please excuse my voice, but I was yelling a lot last night during the UCLA game. So um, first, I want to introduce Kimberly Marteau Emerson and then Ken Roth. Kimberly is going to conduct a conversation with Ken Roth today, and we're going to learn a lot about Chinese political and human rights abuses and all the controversies going on in China. Kimberly is a lawyer, civic leader, and human rights advocate. From 2013 to 2017, she lived in Berlin with her husband, US Ambassador to Germany, John Emerson, where she worked both with the US Embassy as well as independently to drive projects on multiple platforms, including promotion of German immigration and integration efforts related to the 2015-16 refugee crisis, and addressing the issue throughout Germany of bringing women to the economic and political decision-making table. She's currently writing a memoir about her experiences there, and I think that she's pretty much close to culminating that effort. Kimberly worked in the Clinton administration as a senior political appointee and spokesperson for the US Information Agency. She has been an election observer in Nigeria and worked on relief projects in Greece during the 2015 refugee crisis. She serves on the advisory board of the USC Center on Public Diplomacy and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Pacific Council as well. One of my earliest memories of Kimberly is her getting up in a Pacific Council event asking really the most incisive questions. I was thoroughly impressed. I serve with Kimberly on the board of Human Rights Watch, and we are both members of Pacific Council. As I said, she will direct this conversation. Also, fun fact about Kimberly, she loves dancing. And just looking forward to reading your memoir, Kimberly. Now Ken Roth, because he directs the hardest hitting and most fearless human rights organization in the world, Human Rights Watch, because his name sends a chill down the spine of human rights abusers, making them think twice about the potential cost of their repression. Because he knows so many world leaders and he is on a first name basis with many of them. He gets the access. Ken Roth has been the executive director for Human Rights Watch, which is a global organization serving in 90 countries. These countries include the darkest and the most oppressed, and many times these are forgotten countries. I have heard Ken say many times, if we don't do it, who will? Prior to joining Human Rights Watch in 1987, Ken served as a federal prosecutor in New York and for the Iran-Contra investigation in Washington, D.C. A graduate of Yale Law School and Brown University, he has conducted numerous human rights investigations. He has written on a wide range of human rights abuses, devoting special attention to issues of international justice, counterterrorism, the foreign policies of the major powers, and the work of the United Nations. I encourage you to follow Ken on his Twitter account. You know, at first, I get frightened by what he says, but actually it makes me fight harder for all of the things that they do at Human Rights Watch and all of the things that Ken advocates for. Uh, just a reminder, please submit your questions through the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and then passing it on to you, Kimberly. Thank you for being here, everybody.
Thank you, Alicia. And I'm not the only one who likes to dance. So let's put a pin in that. And the next time we'll get together and do that together. Good morning and afternoon to all of you who are joining us. I want to thank the Pacific Council on International Policy and its fabulous leader, Jerry Green, for hosting the Edgerton Series on a Rising China, as well as Brad and Louise Edgerton for making the series possible. And of course, a big thank you to you, Ken, for taking the time to share your thoughts on human rights and China today. Let me take a couple of minutes to set the scene before bringing in Ken. China's steeply rising economic power over the past decades has only been exceeded by its increased repression and severe and pervasive human rights abuses domestically since Xi Jinping came to power as president 8 years ago. Xi's undisguised efforts abroad to protect China's technocratic authoritarianism through expanding its economic influence and undermining the liberal rules-based order are also hallmarks of his leadership style. As we all know, Xi is heading steadily for a third term or more as president, having pushed through abolishment of term limits in China's constitution. He seems undaunted by voices in the West and other democratic nations criticizing and calling for China to stop its tremendous persecution of the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslim populations, its repression in Tibet, its crushing of the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, its massive and ever-widening surveillance of its citizens, and its repression of basic freedoms of expression, religion, and assembly, and its unlawful detention, imprisonment, and torture of Chinese human rights activists and government critics. Xi and his government have reacted strongly to outside criticism of China's abuses. First, China uses its economic clout to punish those abroad, be they governments or in the private sector, for the smallest of slights. Next, it forces political support and approval from a cohort of states that are now locked into Beijing through its massive infrastructure and real estate investments under the Belt and Road Initiative. Third, Xi also gets public support from like-minded leaders who are drawn to China's technocratic authoritarianistic model. Next, China uses its propaganda machine globally to hide or lie about facts it deems harmful to its image. And finally, China strategically wields its membership in multilateral organizations to shield itself and other bad actors from criticisms or actions targeting its human rights violations that might embarrass China or oblige it to honor the international human rights treaties and covenants that it is party to. Though China watches the US with caution and sees it as its only significant rival, Xi seems increasingly confident that no one can thwart China's march to become the world's dominant power. Xi's been reported as saying to his government officials more and more often in the past months, the East is rising and the West is declining. So with that rosy picture, I'm going to turn to you, Ken, and say, let's start by having you give us your perspective on human rights in China at this time.
Okay, well, thanks, Kimberly, and my thanks to the Pacific Council for hosting this event. I think, Kimberly, you summed it up pretty well. This is, many people look at China and feel, oh, here's a country on the rise. But in fact, in human rights terms, this is the darkest period in China, really since the murderous crackdown on the Tiananmen Square pro-democracy movement in 1989. And the two come together, I think, because, while Xi Jinping portrays himself as this confident, self-assured leader, in fact, he is terrified of his own people. And he is increasingly doing everything he can to prevent the people in China from speaking to each other, from speaking out publicly, from organizing together. And I think one way to understand the worsening repression is from this perspective of fear. He is doing anything he can to prevent, what he might describe as a color revolution or some kind of uprising, but really it's just about enabling the people of China to have a say in how they're governed, which is, of course, not the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party. In many ways, the most vivid illustration of that was what has been happening in Hong Kong, where Hong Kong, in a sense, couldn't be allowed to continue as it was because it showed that when people in China were free to express their views about what kind of government they wanted, the last thing they wanted was a dictatorship of the Chinese Communist Party. And so, the Beijing has imposed the so-called national security law on Hong Kong. It really, should be understood as a Chinese Communist Party security law because it's all about preventing, independent, pro-democratic legislators, politicians, activists from continuing to do what they've been promised the ability to do under the one country, two systems agreement, which has now basically been breached. And so we see, variations of that throughout the country. I think at this stage, China is best known for the severity of the crackdown in Xinjiang, where the Uyghur population and other Turkic Muslims have faced extraordinary repression. I mean, of a sort that it's difficult to think of recent precedents. But we don't know what the exact numbers, but I think it's widely known that somewhere in the vicinity of 1.3 million Turkic Muslims have been detained for forced indoctrination, essentially forcing them to give up their religion, to give up their culture, to become Mandarin-speaking quasi-Han Chinese. And as international pressure has mounted because of this extraordinary repression, the Chinese government, while denying any kind of independent inquiry, has gradually said that these are not detention centers; they call them vocational training centers. But they've announced that people are graduating from these so-called vocational training centers, which seems to mean that they are simply put into forced labor. And so, over the last year, the problem of widespread use of forced labor on the part of Uyghur Muslims, again, we don't know the exact magnitude of the problem because independent inspection is not permitted, but it is creating a whole new round of problems for Beijing because, global companies are understandably reluctant to become complicit in this forced labor. They're looking at their supply chains. They're not able with any security to determine, what is in that supply chain because of Beijing's obstructionism. And so you're seeing more and more companies announce that they're not going to purchase cotton from Xinjiang, or they're not going to make other purchases from Xinjiang. And China's retaliating. It's threatening them with economic and other forms of retaliation. So and these are just two examples, Hong Kong and Xinjiang, but you can go around the country. Obviously Tibet, other minorities, such as the Inner Mongolian population has been suffering. Again, a kind of an effort to undermine their culture, any conceivable threat of a movement toward independence, even though there's just no prospect of that happening. But even throughout mainland China, ordinary people, lawyers who try to defend human rights, bloggers who try to speak independently, journalists who might try to probe too far, civic groups that want to speak together in a public manner in a way that the government doesn't want, all of them are facing repression. So it's not a pretty picture at this stage. And again, it all, I think, stems from this fundamental insecurity on the part of Xi Jinping and his government that they need to clamp down because they don't have the consent of the Chinese people.
Thanks, Ken. So even without the consent of the Chinese people and with this clamping down, it does feel like China's increasingly impervious to outside pressure because of all these tactics it uses. What's the strategy to corral China? What will get China to live within the rules-based order?
Yeah, I mean, although it tries to portray itself as impervious to external pressure, in fact, the Chinese government is extraordinarily sensitive to Chinese pressure. And the evidence of that is really how hard they push back when there are examples of external pressure. We're seeing that most recently with these attacks on H&M and various other retailers that had announced that they were concerned about forced labor in Xinjiang, or they were somehow re-examining their supply chains. And suddenly China is saying, we're going to cut you off from the Chinese market if you don't continue to purchase from Xinjiang. But even more broadly, the Chinese government, being a classic dictatorship, is very concerned about portraying itself as an accepted, legitimate government to its people. And it does this in part through censorship and propaganda, but it makes an enormous effort to be accepted as a respected partner by the international community. And so a lot of our strategy at Human Rights Watch has been to deny it the legitimacy that would come from that unquestioning acceptance, and to try to organize governments to speak out against the repression, to go so far as to condemn China and make it clear that in fact Xi Jinping is not accepted in his current form of governance by the rest of the world. Now, this is difficult to do because governments are very worried about retaliation. We're seeing this currently with Australia, which has been the principal, most recent target of Beijing's retaliation, because the Australian government had the audacity to insist on an independent investigation into the origins of the coronavirus in Wuhan. And that simple request, we can get into that in more detail later, but that is a very dangerous topic for Beijing. In fact, we've seen just in the last day that even the World Health Organization, which normally doesn't say anything critical of China, is beginning to question the cover-up and is beginning to say that there's need for more investigation, that this latest investigative report is incomplete. But our strategy really has been to pursue a safeties in numbers approach, to go to governments and say, yes, you rightfully are worried about retaliation if you speak out alone, but if you speak out together with others, Beijing can't retaliate it against the entire world. And we've done a lot of this at the UN Human Rights Council, where we've been, we don't yet have the votes for a formal resolution, but what we've been doing is organizing governments in the context of either the Human Rights Council or sometimes the General Assembly in New York to sign joint documents condemning foremost what's happening in Xinjiang, sometimes also Hong Kong. And if you look at sort of what's happened over the last couple of years, you see how things have evolved in a positive direction. Because the first time we tried this about 2 years ago in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, I think we got on the order of 23 governments to sign on. But everybody was so fearful that there's a tradition that when there is a joint statement like this, that somebody comes and reads it formally before the Human Rights Council. And nobody would do that. They were all afraid. Nobody wanted to stick their neck out. Now, ultimately, the British government read the statement, and Britain had taken the lead for a while. Most recently, the German government took the lead. This past October at the General Assembly in New York, the German government was able to arrange 39 governments to sign on. Turkey issued a parallel statement, so they made a total of 40. Now, what's interesting is that with each of these statements, the Chinese government organizes a counter statement. And it puts together, the thugs and dictators of the world. So you get, Syria and Cuba and, Belarus and, all the great, paragons of human rights respect. And they sign on and say what they're doing in Xinjiang is wonderful. But the numbers willing to endorse Beijing have been diminishing. And the numbers willing to condemn Beijing have been rising to the point that we're almost at parity. And that really worries China, because we're getting to the point that it is not inconceivable that we could introduce a resolution at the UN Human Rights Council, which has never happened, and that China could lose, they could get condemned. Now, we've seen elements of this in related issues of the Human Rights Council. China is currently a member of the Human Rights Council. They were elected this past October. 4 years ago, when they ran for a seat, they received the most votes of any candidate from the Asia Pacific region, which they're a part of. This year, when they ran, they received the fewest number of votes of any of the Asia Pacific candidates, other than Saudi Arabia, which lost. We wanted them to lose, But what this shows is that if there had been one more candidate from that region, China could have lost altogether, the way Russia did several years ago. And that, was a real wake-up call. There was also, every year, the Human Rights Council elects a president from really among the ambassadors in Geneva. And this year was the turn of Asia Pacific. And most people who wanted to defend human rights wanted Fiji to win, a tiny country, but a very good ambassador, very pro-human rights. That's who we were pushing for. China put forward Bahrain, basically practically a province of Saudi Arabia, a country that is highly repressive and has no interest in supporting human rights. The Chinese candidate lost overwhelmingly. Fiji is currently the president. So, these are all illustrations of the fact that, even though, Kimberly, as you mentioned, China has Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative, this $1 trillion effort to, theoretically build infrastructure, but a lot of it is to buy friends and influence around the world, that this hasn't been enough. And that increasingly governments are turning on Beijing. And indeed, the swing votes in this effort are the members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. I think it's 56, 57 Muslim majority nations. And they rightfully are looking at their fellow Muslims in Xinjiang and saying, we got to do something. We can't just applaud this. Now, the OIC as a collective body is really impossible to move because it's very much dominated by Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. both of whom are very much in Beijing's pocket. But we're seeing, from more moderate Muslim majority states, the likes of Indonesia, Malaysia, Afghanistan, Turkey, Albania, Bosnia, Tunisia, Qatar. There's a growing number of states that just don't want any part of this. And they're beginning at least to go neutral, to refuse to support Beijing, and sometimes they're with us. So this swing vote is what is going to get us a majority on the Human Rights Council. And it's where the battle is right now. And come back to where you started with this question. Beijing is very worried about this because this is a key part of its external legitimacy, which it wants to beam back home to show that Xi Jinping is an accepted leader.
And do you think that if he was beamed back home, I mean, if this legitimacy is weakened enough publicly, that China, inside China, where we know that it is the people that have to rise and make a difference, it's the only way that China can change? I mean, where's the movement there? Where's the opportunity, the light, the crack?
I mean, as you are suggesting, Kimberly, with a country the size of China, we're not talking about any external action. The most the rest of the world can do is to try to provide better protection for people in China who are trying to change things. Sometimes it's just a matter of mitigating the repression. I mean, there are some indications, as I mentioned before, that the Chinese government may well be shutting down to some extent the mass detention centers for Turkic Muslims, but it's substituting forced labor. Is that progress? Who knows? But it's movement. It shows a reaction. The government, is going out of its way and speaking with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, the former Chilean president. It's going out of their way to say she's welcome anytime, she can come in. Now, she rightfully is saying, no, I don't want a show tour. I want, my investigators to go in unfettered and look around. They're not allowing that yet. But the fact that they are, kind of feel the need to play this game shows that there is sensitivity there. And I also think we shouldn't, I don't purport to be a China expert, so I don't really know the internal politics, but I know enough to say that, Xi Jinping's break from the usual mold really that's been in place now for decades, where the assumption is that a leader serves for 2 to 5 year terms, that it's very much a collective leadership. There's then a succession plan, and Xi Jinping has broken that. And it's really since Deng Xiaoping this has been in place, and he is really building himself as a dictator for life. That has opposition even in the elite levels of the Chinese Communist Party. So it's impossible to know how all this plays out there, but it's wrong to think of China as monolithic. And I think that this kind of internal reaction, this granting or withholding of legitimacy, plays a factor in this internal competition and could put China back on a more rights-respecting path if it was sustained adequately.
Interesting. Thank you. So I want to remind everybody to put your questions in the Q&A. And so Ken, switching to look at another country that potentially could be influencing China, what can only be interpreted as the next level of tension in the US-China relationship. In Anchorage 2 weeks ago, Xi's diplomatic envoys dismissively accused the US of hypocrisy when Secretary of State Tony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan raised human rights concerns. What role can the US, as China's main competitor on the world stage, still play in pushing China towards the rules-based order?
Well, look, I think, let's take a step backwards for a moment. The Trump years were a disaster. At first, Trump was just, cozying up to Xi Jinping and was going to use his, personal diplomacy to somehow get what he wanted. Ultimately, he turned on China, but it was in such a, self-serving, unprincipled way that it had very little weight. So, you almost got the sense that, yes, he would talk about human rights issues because at least his government would. I don't know that Trump ever really did, but he would have the US government speak about human rights issues, but he'd be happy to sell the Uyghurs off or sell the people of Hong Kong off for, more soybean purchases from Iowa or whatever. It was just a completely instrumental approach to China. And this was, part of a broader, utterly inconsistent human rights policy where the Trump administration, was willing to talk about the human rights problems of adversaries, whether it was, Venezuela or Iran or Cuba or Nicaragua, but not of friends. He cozied up to one friendly autocrat after another, including Putin. Now, the Biden administration has come in and has, one promise to be much more principled. Tony Blinken yesterday, in releasing the State Department's annual human rights report, stressed that they're going to condemn friend or foe. They're going to be consistent. Now, the proof will be in the pudding. We'll have to see whether that actually happens, but he's saying the right thing. The other thing is that Biden's big foreign policy speech, just a few weeks into his administration, stressed, as it should have, multilateralism, because one interesting phenomenon is that even though the Trump administration basically withdrew the U.S. government from the active promotion of human rights, at least in any effective way, the global defense of human rights did not collapse. What we saw was that many governments banded together and, building coalitions typically played a very effective leadership role on all the toughest countries. And so, what I mentioned about, what Britain and Germany did with respect to China, there are many other examples of that. In Latin America, for example, the so-called Lima Group coming together for the first time and addressing human rights in Venezuela. So what Biden understands is that he can't pretend to come in and have the U.S. lead the human rights effort again. That's not credible given these wild oscillations in respect for human rights that we see when each administration shifts in the U.S. But it's also not the right thing to do anymore because, the U.S. should be welcomed as a partner, but this is only going to work with China or anything else if it's done in a genuinely multilateral way. So that's the rhetoric. They've already said that they're going to rejoin or run for the Human Rights Council in October, the next elections. There is a real effort, I think, to build partnerships with others, and that's what's needed. The big questions now are really, sort of how to ratchet up the pressure. The efforts with respect to supply chains, I think, is potentially very powerful, but right now it's operating really just at the level of individual companies, trying to balance, the threat of retaliation from China versus the threat of, their consumer base saying, why are you complicit in this forced labor of all these Uyghur Muslims? A more systematic, governmentally mandated really requirement that people make sure that their supply chains are not infected by Uyghur forced labor. And that if they can't be sure, they don't use that supply chain. That would be very powerful. I think there's really a need for a much tougher effort to push for an unfettered international investigation into what's happening in Xinjiang. And, to take another issue we really haven't talked much about, but the coronavirus, this Wuhan, the WHO report to Wuhan was really inadequate. And the question is now, okay, what next? Are they really going to push to get to the bottom of, not simply, what did China do to cover up during the early days of the outbreak, but where did it come from? And, did it come from the Virological Institute? Did it come from something else? Right now, China is doing everything it can to block that and really pushing for a genuine international inquiry there that is not subject to obstructionism by Beijing is a very important thing to do.
Yeah, the WHO report got fairly criticized for the lack of, not necessarily their fault, but the lack of access that they were given, that the data was controlled. And in fact, I read Annie's piece. Ken's wife, Annie, wrote a piece in Foreign Policy unpacking the TikTok, the chronology of China's suppression of information and its misrepresentations, which is really interesting to read. Is there anything we can seize on in those facts that have been brought to light? Are they being taken to a higher level? Is Congress, are international bodies looking at those misrepresentations?
Well, I think that there are two important dimensions to the coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan. One, my wife, whose name is Dr. Annie Sparrow, she had this piece in Foreign Policy where she really describes how the Chinese government covered up for the first 3 weeks in mostly January 2020, the human-to-human spread. They maintained a fiction early on that every case of infection was directly linked to the Wuhan market, that it was not spreading among people. And they maintained that fiction to the point of sacrificing healthcare workers because they couldn't afford to kind of reveal the lie. So they would repress, reprimand, censor healthcare workers who tried to warn their colleagues. They would literally tell healthcare workers they were not allowed to wear protective equipment because that would, they said, give rise to panic, but what they really meant is it would expose the lie. And this is important because, we have to think beyond COVID-19. What about the next pandemic? And the critical early warning that we have is from our healthcare workers. And given that SARS began in China, that COVID-19 began in China, it is not inconceivable that we're going to have another outbreak, viral outbreak starting in China. And what are you going to learn if you're a Chinese doctor, a Chinese healthcare worker, and you see what happened to the doctors in Wuhan who tried to warn people? This time you're going to just keep your mouth shut. Mm-hmm. And we're a lot worse off because, by China denying that there was human-to-human spread during those 3 weeks, while literally millions of people fled Wuhan, it enabled the virus to go global. And indeed, this downplaying of human-to-human transmission misled the rest of the world for a while. It's why there were so many Italian healthcare workers who died, because the Italian authorities were so busy looking for people who would come immediately from China that they weren't focusing on the spread among Italians, which is what was killing the healthcare workers. So, that is an ongoing issue if we want to really be prepared for the next pandemic. But the other really open question is, where did COVID-19 come from? And, the dominant view is that it came from bats, and that may well be true. But there is, some suspicious evidence pointing to the Wuhan Virological Institute. And, this was an institute which was doing research on coronaviruses. It was doing so-called gain of function research, where they try to make viruses, stronger in order to better understand them. And there is an indication that several of the workers in the lab in the months before the official outbreak in December had come down with a disease, the symptoms of which were consistent with either the flu or the coronavirus. WHO, the investigative team said, can we have, the medical data of these individuals? No. In fact, they don't have any of the individualized data for any of the early victims of the coronavirus. And so, we're still going, China at this point, I think, accepts that the virus didn't begin in the Wuhan market. But, these earlier cases, the handful of earlier cases would point to where it did begin, and they refused to turn that over. Why is that? What are they hiding? Mm-hmm. It's very important to know this if we're going to prepare for the next possible pandemic.
Thank you. That's super interesting. We actually have a lot of questions lined up. I just have one more question that I would love for you to address when we were talking about how the U.S. could, what the U.S. could do to impact China more strongly on its rights records. And one of the things it has done, along with Canada, the UK, and the EU, is to basically label it. Well, the Biden administration didn't label it, but they endorsed the labeling of it as a genocide, although Human Rights Watch has not come to that conclusion. But does that legal categorization give any added ammunition to international bodies such as the UN or the International Criminal Court? What does that mean? Is that helpful?
Look, obviously you want to call mass atrocities of this sort by the proper name. And whether that's genocide, crimes against humanity, or just, large scale detention, forcing people to give up their religion and culture, I think in many ways the precise label matters less than a clear factual understanding of what's happening. Now, the genocide determination is being made, I think, based not so much on mass slaughter, which is how most people think of genocide, but it can also be genocide if you are, essentially denying, a national, ethnic, religious group the opportunity to reproduce. And there is, some evidence, but again, we don't really know the extent of it, of forced sterilization. What we don't really know is whether the forced sterilization of the Uyghurs is more than the forced sterilization that we're seeing elsewhere in China. Clearly, the forcing couples apart is preventing reproduction. The forcing of children into state orphanages where they're indoctrinated while their parents are, off in detention is a separate issue. So these are all horrible problems. We don't really know the scope of it just yet. And I think the real, the urgent next task is to get an unfettered UN investigation in there, which, China is resisting as fiercely as it can. So, all of this, by all means, we should, use the appropriate labels, but at this point, we really need to know more facts.
Thank you. I'm going to turn now to the questions because, like I said, we have quite a few of them. So the first question, Ken, is China's now on the UN Human Rights Council, which is interesting because it never ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and everybody else there has, but it hasn't. But anyway, it's on the Human Rights Council. It was appointed last year to a special panel, which will select the next group of special rapporteurs. Should we be giving up on the council for bringing China to account on human rights if it's kind of the fox inside the chicken coop?
Yeah, no, I would not give up on the council. The critics of the council, and often, the most vociferous critics are defenders of Israel because the council criticizes Israel so much. And they try to say, oh, look at, they're the following abusive members are on the council, therefore let's give up on the council. And in fact, we would certainly be happier not to have these members there. The original idea of the Human Rights Council was you would have competitive elections, and those competitive elections gave us the opportunity to, vote in positive people and keep the thugs out. That worked for a while, but the regions are beginning to game the system, and they tend to put forward the same number of candidates as openings, with the result that the likes of China and Russia get on the council. But they still represent a minority. We win in the council all the time around, Myanmar, Syria, Sudan, Eritrea. I could go on and on. It's many, many countries do get condemned by the council. Certain of the more powerful ones like China have been able to escape it. Similarly, Saudi Arabia domestically, although Saudi Arabia and Yemen is subject to UN Human Rights Council scrutiny. Egypt has so far avoided it. But, as I was, part of my reason for going through those numbers earlier is that we're getting to the point where it's not inconceivable that we can win a resolution at the Human Rights Council. So we are not at all giving up on the council. We, in fact, are actively right now recruiting moderate Muslim majority countries because they can push us over the edge and give us the majority that we need.
Yeah, as you said, the swing vote, it was reminding me of the election here, going after those door knocking on those members of the OIC. Okay, here's our next question. Thank you. This is, I'm going to try to let you know who's asking the question, but this one happens to be anonymous. For global companies sourcing in China, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, making statements on forced labor in Xinjiang. As H&M has learned, and you mentioned the cotton issue, there are severe economic consequences of taking a position. But from a human rights lens, companies are also concerned about retaliation and security threats against their own China-based employees. How can companies navigate this complex landscape? What's the role for governments versus global companies?
Okay, well, let me start with the end part of that question, because the easiest way to relieve companies of, the heat that they get for taking a human rights stand on China is for governments to mandate that. And so if governments say, given the state of knowledge, given the lack of independent inspection, we are barring companies from sourcing out of Xinjiang, just as an example. That would be very powerful. There'd be no retaliation against companies because it'd be the government's fault. So that is, if companies are thinking this through, I know there's kind of this instinctive allergy to governmental regulation, but this is a regulation that they should welcome. And indeed, we're seeing this, more broadly on the supply chain issue because, kind of the big brand name companies are vulnerable to consumer boycotts, to kind of loss of their reputation if their supply chains are found to be tainted, not simply in China, but any place in the world. And so we see that increasingly companies, the big ones, are pushing for governmental rules and regulations on supply chains. They're in that case worried about competition from kind of lower no-name companies that don't have a reputation to lose, so they don't pay much attention to their supply chain. But that same logic, that governmental regulation can be a friend of companies trying to do the right thing, I think would apply in the case of China. Obviously, if you're just a single company operating alone, you have to balance, how important is the Chinese market versus how important is your global reputation. And even H&M, which was one of the first to say they were going to stop buying cotton from Xinjiang. And Xinjiang represents, I think, about 20% of the world's supply. Almost all of China's cotton is produced in Xinjiang. So that was, an important statement there. It wasn't just that they were expressing concern. They're saying we're not going to be complicit in these atrocities. And now, Beijing is coming back and saying, well, you may not have access to our market. But I think the more companies that do that, the less that kind of retaliation is possible. And of course, the more governments mandate it, the less the companies are the subject of retaliation.
Thank you. Yeah, it seems like there's safety in numbers and then safety if you have political cover. Here's a question from Ted Picone, who is on the council, the Pacific Council. Given rising geopolitical tensions in the region and growing support for the Quad as a counterweight to China, how do we see India's role? Concern is that recent worrisome backsliding in India's human rights behavior may get less attention or condemnation in order to support a collective approach to Beijing.
Yes, well, I think, Ted, you're right that one of the things we've warned the Biden administration about is that in their eagerness to, build an alliance with the Modi government against China, they should not be ignoring what has been a serious backsliding on human rights in India under the BJP and Modi. So now, in terms of India's role on human rights generally, it's rare that they will support human rights initiatives targeting a particular country. There's been their longstanding position, frankly, because there's so much that can be criticized within India, and they don't want, that vulnerability. Now, on China, there clearly is, geopolitical tension, a struggle between India and China. And so it's not inconceivable that India could join efforts to spotlight human rights abuses in China, despite its usual practices. But it's going to bump into the problem of consistency. And, even in Myanmar right now, where, it's been, sometimes the border's open, sometimes it's closed for people fleeing the junta's repression in Myanmar. India does not have a consistent external record on human rights. And obviously its internal record has been degenerating.
Thank you. Jane Olson has a question. How serious, and just for those of you who may or may not know Jane was chair of the board of Human Rights Watch for many, many years and remains an incredible source of inspiration on human rights. Welcome, Jane. How serious is China's military expansion and aggression in the sea? What about its extraction of precious metals from mines in Africa and elsewhere?
Look, on the military aggression, this is kind of beyond my competence, so I can't really say much beyond what is kind of widely known in the papers. Yes, they've gradually taken over these, islands and islets and little spits of land in the South China Sea and are militarizing them. That has kind of become de facto accepted because nobody is going to bother going to war over that, even though there are minerals at stake in the South China Sea. But I think the big threat is Taiwan. And, if Beijing were to militarily move on Taiwan, there's a big risk of a war. The US would be under enormous pressure to defend Taiwan. Taiwan's obviously a lot closer to mainland China than it is to the United States. This would not be a pretty affair. But I think that that's the form of military aggression that most people are very worried about. And would Xi Jinping do this? It's going to be in his mind a kind of a trade-off between, how much does he need the rally around the flag legitimacy that a military adventure would bring to him versus, the enormous economic setback that invasion of Taiwan would represent, since clearly, there would be, widespread sanctions and just general dislocation of the economy. So, I'm hopeful that he's not that rash, but you just never know. And it probably depends how desperate he feels at home, how insecure he feels. In terms of, the mining of in Africa, the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of that is about gaining access to commodities of various sorts that China covets out of Africa. And it is, it had been advertised as $1 trillion effort. It clearly is being scaled back. And the reasons for that scaling back are not entirely clear. I think part of it is just, China is going through a tough patch at home, and so they don't have the resources to throw into this. Part of it is that Belt and Road is getting a bad name because it's seen as serving China more than many of the supposed beneficiaries. Some of the projects are seen as debt traps, whether it's the Sri Lankan port or the, Mombasa-Nairobi Railroad in Kenya. Some are seen as, mainly benefiting Chinese contractors, not so much locals. The lack of even basic transparency, the kind of transparency that has become more normal with World Bank or IMF loans, is absent with Belt and Road Initiative loans. And so a lot of them, maybe half goes to the project and half goes to the leaders' Swiss bank accounts. There's just no accountability there. So, through these variety of factors, it is less and less popular by the people of these countries, even if more autocratic rulers are happy to pocket a good part of the money.
Wow. Well, the next question I have is coming from Martha Sardinius. And it's a question about Chinese intelligence. And I think that what I'd be curious to hear, and kind of Martha, going to take your question. She's wondering if it's mostly about copying tech and copyrights and why they stayed away from the US. Did they stay away from the US presidential election? I don't know. But I think that it's maybe a broader question about Chinese surveillance and its use of its technology to creep into other systems, and or perhaps you can talk a little bit about how it's impacting the Chinese people.
Look, I think that I have no special insight into Chinese intelligence. What I do know is that the Chinese government is extraordinarily attentive to what the Chinese diaspora says. And so there is an active effort to monitor the diaspora, whether it's students or workers or others abroad, and to pressure them to stop any criticism of Beijing. Doing this, by letting them know that they're being watched, but also by threatening family members back home. And we're seeing this. The BBC has an account out this morning of Uyghurs who were involved in helping the BBC describe the sexual abuse of Uyghur women in Xinjiang. And these Uyghurs in the West now, in exile, are being contacted by Chinese intelligence and basically saying, you keep this up, your family member is going to be in big trouble. And so there's, there are no qualms about using that kind of, really blackmail with one's loved ones back home to silence comments abroad. But when we think about Chinese censorship overseas, it's a mistake just to think about ethnic Chinese people, because all of us are also victims, in a sense, of what is becoming a global censorship effort. So, when the Houston Rockets general manager, tweeted support for the Hong Kong pro-democracy protesters, China came down on them like a bunch of bricks. And it was a nothing thing, but it shows how utterly sensitive China is to any criticism and its willingness to use its economic clout, in this case, a huge television contract with the National Basketball Association, to censor that kind of commentary. And, you see this in Hollywood. You're all in LA. Hollywood movies now, because so many of them show in China, are censoring themselves to make sure that they're China palatable.
Mhm.
And so we're seeing, more and more that companies, individuals, kind of anybody with an economic interest in China is either self-censoring or is actively being censored by Beijing. And this, is bad enough that the Chinese people are subject to this, but increasingly the rest of the world is subject to this kind of censorship.
Hmm. Thank you. Next question actually comes from my cousin through my husband, Margaret McQuaig Johnston, who's up in Toronto and is actually a China expert, and is especially watching China now with the trial of the two Canadians, the two Michaels, as they call them. But her question is, there's an international discussion of having a D10 group of democracies, the G7 plus Australia, India, and South Korea, stand up to China. Would you see that group focusing on human rights?
Well, obviously, Margaret, any group that addresses China is going to be utterly ineffective unless it includes human rights within its agenda. So I would completely expect that a D10 of that sort would. I think in many ways, though, when this is implicit in my earlier comments, the most important thing that the big democracies can do is not simply kind of continue to organize these joint statements among themselves, but also to reach out to the rest of the world. And this is kind of a numbers game, but there are governments clearly in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, who would be willing, with a little bit of encouragement, to speak out about what's going on, say in Xinjiang. And one thing the big economic powers can do is to say, we encourage you to speak out, but and if you're subject to retaliation, we're going to help you. We're not going to leave you dangling. But things of that sort, and really building a global coalition, not just among the usual suspects, but among the global South, where China sees itself as somehow representing them or more broadly accepted. If that begins to break down, that really dents Xi Jinping's legitimacy. And I think that effort to sort of build a broader North-South coalition around Chinese human rights issues is the most important thing that the big Western democracies can do.
Thank you. And actually, I'm just looking at these list of questions. There's another one that wanted to know the latest on the case of the two Michaels.
Well, about a month ago, the Canadian government led a very good initiative. I forget the exact number, but they must have had 40 some governments sign on. And it was all done very diplomatically. It was an initiative against arbitrary detention in state-to-state relations. No country was ever named. But what this was about was governments that seize foreign nationals as hostages for foreign policy purposes. And that's obviously what China is doing in the case of the so-called two Michaels, two Canadian citizens whose only offense was being Canadian citizens in China. China detained them to try to get the Huawei CFO released from extradition proceedings in Vancouver, where the US is seeking her extradition to the United States for alleged sanction violations with respect to Iran. And it's just it's a blatant case of hostage taking. Now, this is, Canada's been very strong on this point. But I think they are, and it was a good sign that so many governments rallied behind them. But it shows the depths that the Chinese government is willing to go in order to try to get its way. And I don't sadly see an immediate prospect for the release of the two Michaels, so long as the prosecution of the Huawei CFO proceeds, which, and I would, I'd be very reluctant for the Biden administration or the Canadian government, the Trudeau administration, to succumb to that kind of blackmail. I would hope it wouldn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Do U.S. universities, this is an anonymous question, do U.S. universities aid and abet Chinese human rights abuses through their engagement in China and via the presence of Confucius Institutes and large numbers of Chinese graduate students in the U.S.? Should the behavior of U.S. universities change? And if so, how?
Well, it's interesting. Human Rights Watch has been quite involved in developing, basically an ethical code for how U.S. universities can engage with China in both of the respects that you mentioned. On the one hand, operating campuses or branches of campuses in China. On the other hand, welcoming Chinese students at US universities. And as a general matter, I think these kinds of university exchanges are very good. It helps people understand each other. We certainly want more Chinese citizens having the advantages of a kind of open, critical thinking US education. But we have to be very aware of the censorship efforts. The Confucius Institutes are really, have largely become propaganda machines. And I think we have to be careful about universities sort of taking the money involved in that, because it's all Chinese government money, and then trying to silence their professors or limit what can be said on campus or restricting symposiums or seminars. There's a real threat of censorship of academic freedom. The Chinese government has no qualms about trying to exercise that censorship. And it is hard for universities to resist when there's a lot of money at stake. And so, it is often the best solution to that is don't become dependent on the money to begin with. Recognize that this is strings attached to money, and find other ways to teach Mandarin or to welcome Chinese students without the Chinese government involved. Similarly with branches overseas, I would be very reluctant to spend a lot of money on real estate or infrastructure that you're reluctant to lose. The best kind of overseas presences are very light footprint ones, where if the Chinese government starts trying to censor, you can just pull out and there's not a huge loss.
Mm-hmm.
But if there are major institutes built or the like, universities are less likely to pull the plug, and that's when they become very vulnerable to censorship.
Yeah, of course. I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to take moderator's privilege to kind of take one of these and shape it a little bit. Madeline Bluderoo asks, how could we better counter the Chinese influence and rhetoric over human rights issues in other countries when China tries to retaliate and export its vision of human rights? And I guess that one of the questions that's been in my mind is, how do we convince, there are countries and populations which look at China's technocratic authoritarianism and say, wow, that looks like it's working. It's delivering the goods to its people. Is it? But it's apparently tries to say it's delivering the goods to its people. But you just have to trade off some rights in order to get what you need to live. And that's the question I have, is how do we convince people that perhaps that's not the way, that the form of government that might be best suited for them?
No, Kimberly, that's a very good question. And indeed, that's the argument the Chinese government makes all the time. Look at how many people have been pulled out of poverty. We needed to violate rights in order to get here. Now, there's, a certain premise in that is worth questioning. Yes, there's been rapid economic growth, from the lows of the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, which were imposed by the same Chinese Communist Party. So, the same autocrats, the same dictators that had utter devastation have now basically left the Chinese people to themselves. Is this the brilliance of the Communist Party, or is it just the vigor and initiative of the Chinese people that, where suddenly the Communist Party backed off in the economic realm? But I think that it's always very important to kind of scratch the surface behind these claims. And so, yes, the Chinese government stopped the pandemic within China, but did they start the pandemic through their instinctive censorship and crackdown on the doctors who tried to warn us? Is that why we have a pandemic today? Because of the same dictatorship that, for the time being at least, has stopped its spread within China. This idea of, everybody being richer, the Chinese government, interestingly, doesn't like to talk about even economic rights. Of course, they don't want to talk about civil and political rights. We all know they flout those. But they don't even like to talk about economic rights, because economic rights require that you look at the fate of the worst off people of society to see, is life getting better for them? Are government resources being devoted to them? China doesn't want that inquiry. They don't want you looking at the rural residents or the migrant workers who had to leave their kids back home and are living in decrepit conditions outside of Shanghai or Beijing. They want you to talk about GNP, about gross domestic product. And they, are happy at that macro level, but they don't want, a focus on the individual. And so I think that the best way to fight back is to insist on focusing on the individual. Say, okay, these are your big claims, but how are actual people being affected? And we're not going to look at just the elites living in the big cities. We're going to try to look at everybody else. And then the picture isn't so pretty. And you begin to see what life is like when you're living under a dictatorship that has no constraints, that is utterly arbitrary, that can choose to, imprison 1 million people because they have the wrong religion or speak the wrong language. And that is, not such an attractive picture for the rest of the world.
Thank you. Good answer. Listen, we are out of time. The hour went really quickly, and I just want to thank you, Ken, first of all, for giving us your time and your incredible wisdom and all the hard work you've done at Human Rights Watch over these past almost 30 years, trying to help right the world's wrongs. And of course, I'm very proud, and I know Alicia is, and anyone else on this call who's with the organization, to be supporters of the organization and be involved. And I want to thank the Pacific Council for hosting this again, and the Edgertons for this series. And finally, I want to thank all of you for joining us for this interesting conversation. And we'll look forward to seeing you at the next one. So bye, everybody. Thanks so much.